Kuperman, who will talk about the NATO intervention in Libya and humanitarian success with a question mark, and of course that is intriguing, and we will explain all about that. We are very happy that Alan is here at ISS. He is at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Indeed, with a track record in research on ethnic conflict, on military interventions, on nuclear proliferation as well. He's currently also leading a research program financed by the Pentagon on, how would you call that? Constitutional design and mechanisms, or conflict management, and the way certain constitutional design can cope with conflicts. Conflict because of climate change, stresses and shocks such as floods and droughts. He might also like to report on that if you question him about that. It's particularly of interest to us, this collaboration between researchers and policymakers. As you are aware of the fact that ISS is also involved in many networks working together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also some other ministries in the Netherlands. It's a particular, how would you say, skill to do that. It has its advantages and disadvantages. I always say knowledge production takes place in various corners of the world, not only in academic institutions, but also in ministries or NGOs. And there's always challenges to bring that together. Now you might question Alan Kuperman on that as well. I'm particularly happy that Mohammed Saleh, our Deputy Director Research, managed to invite him here at ISS to talk about a major issue we have been looking at in the past 2 years, the intervention in Libya and its humanitarian consequences. So Alan, please take over, and the floor is yours. Alan will speak about 40 minutes. And then we'll, of course, have ample time to discuss what is brought forward or what you want to discuss with him.
Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. Okay, so you see the title of the talk, and that's what we're going to be thinking about, how we would decide was the intervention a humanitarian success or not? What methodology would we use to figure that out? And then what is the evidence that we can bring to the table to try to make an educated decision about it? In my country, the United States, there is a common wisdom that, of course, the intervention was a humanitarian success. And I would say this is not just common wisdom in the United States, but throughout much of the NATO alliance, much of the Western world. And this common narrative goes as follows, that in early 2011, following on the heels of the beginning of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, that in Libya there was initially a peaceful, nationwide uprising versus a dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. In response to this purely peaceful uprising, Gaddafi used brutal force, and within 3 days had killed thousands of peaceful protesters. Only because of this brutal crackdown did the uprising switch from being a peaceful uprising to an armed rebellion, merely in self-defense against Gaddafi's attacks. Gaddafi's security forces then escalated, and they launched indiscriminate attacks using artillery and air power, indiscriminate attacks on civilians. After Gaddafi captured most of the cities where the uprisings had occurred, and there was only one major city left, Benghazi, Gaddafi threatened a bloodbath in Benghazi. It was at that point that the UN authorized an intervention and NATO launched an intervention exclusively, quote unquote, to protect civilians. That was the objective. After protecting civilians, after the intervention protected civilians, then because of the nationwide support in Libya that these rebels had, the rebels were able to overthrow Gaddafi and pave the way for democracy. And so in conclusion, the common wisdom would say that NATO intervention prevented a Rwanda-like genocide and promoted freedom and democracy in Libya. And this is not some fantasy that I have of the common wisdom. This is the common wisdom. It was documented recently in Foreign Affairs magazine, which in the US is our leading journal of foreign affairs, and it was in an article written by the US Permanent Representative to NATO and by the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General James Stavridis. And this is what they say, quote, NATO's operation in Libya has rightly been hailed as a model intervention. So not only was it a great success, but it's a model for future interventions. Quote, the alliance responded rapidly to a deteriorating situation that threatened hundreds of thousands of civilians who were rebelling against an oppressive regime. And the NATO intervention, quote, succeeded in protecting those civilians. So that's it. This is the common wisdom. And there's only one problem with this narrative, and that is that almost every single element of it is false. Okay, maybe it's a big problem. So let's go through, at the start, just a couple of the key elements of the common wisdom. Before we get to this question of the net impact of intervention, let's interrogate the common wisdom a little bit. Did Gaddafi target peaceful civilians? Not initially, no. No. Although there were some reports in Western media that these, and in fact a lot of reports in Western media that these protests were exclusively peaceful, they were not. They were violent from the first day. From the first day in Benghazi, the protesters were using firearms, they were using petrol bombs, and they were using vehicles as weapons, whether it be bulldozers or whether driving vehicles through fences or loading vehicles with improvised explosive devices. They were violent from the start during those first 3 days. Secondly, Gaddafi's security forces actually used restraint at the beginning. They did not use gunfire until the protesters themselves turned violent during those first 3 days. And then when Gaddafi's forces did initiate the retaliatory use of gunfire, they did not shoot to kill. They shot to wound. And we know this for several reasons. First of all, we have first-hand accounts from Western doctors who happened to be working in Benghazi at the time, and they said that they were getting wounds in the legs, not in the torso, which is clear evidence that it's not indiscriminate fire, it's very, very targeted fire, and it's targeted to wound, not to kill. In addition, the UN did an inquiry which came out in March 2012, and they interviewed folks who had been in Gaddafi's security forces and then went over to the rebel side. But at the time, those first 3 days, they were in Gaddafi's security forces, and they said they got orders, shoot, first not to shoot, and then when they were being shot at, to return fire, but to shoot to wound, not to kill. The initial death toll during those first 3 days was not thousands, 3,000 or 4,000, as was reported in Western media at the time, but was in fact on the order of 200 or 300. So the reports at the time were exaggerated by a factor of 10 or more. We also know that even after the war spread, and I'll go through how the war spread over the first few weeks, that Gaddafi's forces, although they now started to use deadly force against the rebels, they still were very discriminate in their use of force, not indiscriminate in their use of force. So for example, the city of Misrata, which was the location of the most intense fighting during those first few weeks of the war. Human Rights Watch reported in April 2011, almost 2 months into the war, that of all the wounded in the city of Misrata, only 3% were women. Now, if you were using indiscriminate force, if you were firing artillery indiscriminately into residential areas, which was exactly what was the accusation at the time by Western government officials and by Western media, if you're firing indiscriminately into residential areas, you don't have to be a genius to know that the percentage of women who should be casualties is 50%, not 3%. And so this is crucial evidence that Gaddafi's forces were targeting not indiscriminately against civilians, but very, very discriminately against rebels who were almost exclusively men. And that's how you wind up with only 3% of the wounded being women. Moreover, they were not killing a lot of people in relative to what we consider in civil war. So Misrata is a city of 400,000 people, and in the course of nearly 2 months of fighting, Human Rights Watch reported that 257 people had been killed. Okay? For those of you who studied war, fought in war, you know that if you want to kill 257 people in a city, it would take about 5 minutes. Right? If that's your goal, to kill civilians, it would take 5 minutes. You would just bomb a very densely populated area. Hundreds of people could be killed. The fact that Gaddafi's forces took nearly 2 months to kill that many people meant that they weren't trying to kill civilians. In fact, they were desperately trying to avoid killing civilians. They wanted to target the rebels, but avoid the civilians. As Gaddafi's forces got mobilized and started to recapture these cities where there had been uprising, he captured one after the other after the other, and I'll go through that on a map with you and show you how it was done. In how many of these cities did he or his forces commit a bloodbath? In 0 of these cities. And yet, when there was only one city left, Benghazi, Western media, Western politicians said, if he recaptures this last city, he's going to commit a bloodbath. Why? Why would we believe that? There's no reason to believe that he would have done that. He had recaptured all these other cities where he could have committed bloodbaths, and he didn't. That wasn't his policy. His policy was to recapture the cities, take control of them, not to carry out vengeance. He had the chance, and he didn't do it. And he explained this. He explained this as his forces approached Benghazi after they'd recaptured all the other cities. He said, I am not going to target civilians. Moreover, I'm not going to target rebels who surrender. Moreover, any rebel who wants to flee is welcome to flee, and I give them free passage eastward to Egypt. The only people we'll kill, he said, are rebels who stay in Benghazi and continue to fight us. And he said he would be merciless against them. That is not a bloodbath. That is narrowly targeted killing of what a former U.S. Secretary of Defense once labeled dead enders. Those who, even when they're going to lose, they continue to fight to the bitter end. And those folks he would have targeted. But that is not a bloodbath. That's killing the remnants of a rebellion. And just to be clear, when I say that Gaddafi's forces didn't initiate the violence, I'm talking about those first 3 days. Okay? In those first 3 days, it was the protesters who used violence first. Once the rebellion was full-blown, then in some other cities where Gaddafi's forces thought, and probably rightly so, that rebellions were about to break out, his forces did initiate violence. but not at the beginning. It's counter to the narrative. That's widely accepted. So that's the first interrogation of the common wisdom. Did Gaddafi target peaceful civilians? No, not at the start of this conflict. That is not how this conflict became violent. This conflict became violent because the protesters initiated violence. Now, the second of the two pieces of conventional wisdom that we're going to interrogate at the beginning is, was NATO's intervention to protect civilians? And the answer is that it may well have been motivated initially by a desire to protect civilians. So I'm not saying that there was some secret ulterior motive that gave rise to the UN resolution. I believe the UN resolution was motivated by outrage at the perceived targeting of civilians and a desire to protect those civilians. But once NATO decided to use force to implement that UN resolution, was their primary objective to protect civilians? The answer is no. Their primary objective almost immediately switched to regime change. That is the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. How do we know this? Lots and lots of evidence. So, for example, NATO targeted not just Gaddafi forces that were attacking civilians or poised to attack civilians or poised to attack rebels, but NATO bombed Gaddafi's forces that were in abject retreat. Now, retreating forces aren't attacking civilians. So when you bomb retreating forces, you're not protecting civilians. You're just destroying an army and helping a rebel group overthrow that regime. Secondly, NATO targeted security forces in areas that were strongholds for Gaddafi. That is where all of the people in the city supported Gaddafi. For example, Sirte. There was no opposition to Gaddafi, as far as we know, in Sirte. There were Gaddafi forces in Sirte. They were not a threat to those civilians because the civilians loved those forces. And yet NATO bombed those forces. Again, not to protect civilians, but simply to weaken the regime so it could be overthrown. Third, NATO provided intelligence to the rebels to help them defeat Gaddafi's forces. The USA, for example, provided the rebels with such intelligence. Fourth, NATO facilitated the training and arming of the rebels by land and by sea, with weapons provided from France, Qatar, Sudan, and other countries. Now again, if you're trying to protect civilians, do you fuel a civil war? If you're trying to overthrow a regime, do you fuel a civil war? Yes. And then the last piece of evidence is that even when the rebels rejected ceasefire offers over and over and over, Gaddafi offered many, many ceasefire offers. The rebels rejected them. Every single one. But NATO continued bombing. Right? So if the real goal were to protect civilians, what NATO would have said to the rebels is, accept the ceasefire. Let's stop the killing. Let's protect civilians. The longer the civil war goes on, the more civilians are going to die. So if NATO really cared about protecting civilians, they would have pressured the rebels to accept the ceasefire. They would have said, if you don't accept the ceasefire, we're going to stop bombing Gaddafi's forces. And NATO never said that. So all of this evidence, this abundant evidence, makes clear that regardless of what the original motivation was, almost immediately, NATO switched its objective from protecting civilians to overthrowing the regime. And as a result, many more civilians died. Okay, so as I said, I want to go through how this war progressed. Many of you may be experts on this, you may already know this, and so this will be a review for you. But for others, this is maybe ancient history already. It was March of 2011, so it's more than a year ago. So let's just quickly go through this. we see that where we have those yellow stars are where there were the initial uprisings in Libya from February 17th to February 19th of 2011. You'll see that 4 of these were in the east, 1 of these was in the west. Only the 4 in the east were violent. And so you say to yourself, well, I thought this was a nationwide uprising against Gaddafi because he was a dictator. But when you look at the map and you see, but why were there only violent uprisings in the east? It's your first signal that this narrative is not exactly right. This was not a nationwide peaceful uprising against Gaddafi. This was a regional armed rebellion against Gaddafi. And when you go back and study Libyan history, you learn that there's this long rivalry between the East and the West, with one side controlling it and subordinating the other side. And Gaddafi was from the West or from the center of Libya. And the folks in the East had resented this for 4 decades. And now they were going to use force to take back control. And when we see the other cities that I'll talk about that initially became violent and that fought the hardest, for example, Misrata, again, we have tribal rivalry with Gaddafi's tribes and tribes associated with Gaddafi. So this was not a nationwide democratic uprising. This was a regional and tribal rebellion. You do see, as I said, in the next few days, the beginnings of uprisings in Misrata, which is in the center of the country. Again, this is a tribal rivalry with Gaddafi's group, and in the west of Tripoli, again, where we have some tribal and ethnic rivals of Gaddafi. These maps, by the way, were done by The Guardian, a newspaper, and I appreciate being able to use them. In the initial days of the rebellion, Gaddafi's forces were surprised. They weren't expecting this big of a rebellion, and as a result, they didn't have their act together to try and stop it. And as a result, the rebels made great progress. And as you can see, they take much of eastern Libya. And much of Libya doesn't have large populations, so when I say eastern Libya, I'm talking about the coastal cities. And they make progress, and they continue to make progress. They go from Benghazi to Ajdabiya to Brega. And finally, Libyan security forces try to mount a defense at Ras Lanuf, and in those first few days, they fail. And so by March 5th, this is about 2 weeks into the war, this is the high point of the rebellion. You can see that the rebels have captured essentially all of the cities in eastern Libya, and some cities surrounding the capital Tripoli. All of those cities marked in red are under rebel control. This is the high point of the rebellion, but it did not last very long. And the reason it didn't last very long is that these rebels were very ragtag. Except for a few forces that had defected from the army, these were folks who had no training, very few weapons, very little ammunition, no business confronting a serious or even a middling real army. And that's what Gaddafi had. He had a middling real army. And so Libyan security forces then counterattack around March 7th, and they quickly wipe out all of these rebel gains and push the rebels back, both in the east and in the west. We see they first take Ras Lanuf, then they take Brega, then they take Ajdabiya, and then you'll start to see that the cities in the areas in the west around Tripoli also start to fall. They go from red to green. And so that in 1 week, the rebels have lost all but one city, that is Benghazi. And then Gaddafi's forces start to close in on Benghazi. You'll see in the west now, there are no cities under rebel control. And in the east, we only have Benghazi, and these other towns are really minor, with small populations. And so on this day, March 16th, we have the son, one of the children of Muammar Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, claims everything will be over in 48 hours. Okay? And that seems to make sense if you think about the fact that it only took 1 week for Gaddafi's forces to recapture all of the rebel-held towns, and now there's only one major town left. It seems likely that this town is going to fall in a couple days, and the rebellion is over. And that, I think, is what would have happened. Except, there was an intervention. On March 17th, the very next day, the UN Security Council authorized a few things. First of all, a no-fly zone to be established in Libya. Secondly, all necessary force to protect civilians in Libya, except no ground forces could be deployed. 2 days later, NATO started implementing this resolution in the way that I started talking about, by bombing Gaddafi's forces, bombing retreating Gaddafi forces, bombing Gaddafi forces in areas where civilians supported them. And as a result, the rebels quickly went back on the march. And we see the first thing they do is go from Benghazi to Ashdabia, then they capture Brega and Ras Lanuf, so it's a rerun of what had just happened about a month earlier. But because they were so poorly equipped, poorly trained, they outran their supply lines, and so Gaddafi's forces were able to push them back a little bit, recapture these cities. And what you get then is about a 4-month standoff, where the rebels are too weak and disorganized to go any further west, but Libyan Gaddafi's forces are too much under fire from NATO to go any further east. And so these towns switch hands many times, 3 times, 4 times, or even more. Each time they're captured or recaptured or lost, people are killed. People are killed on the rebel side, people are killed on the security forces side, and civilians are killed in the middle. Eventually, Gaddafi's forces start to be weakened by the bombing and by the embargo sufficiently, and the rebels start to be strengthened sufficiently by the arming, training, and provision of intelligence from NATO and its allies, that 4 months later, they start to go on the march again. And we see they recapture Brega and Ras Lanuf. They also start to attack from the western mountains, Zintan, west of Tripoli. And Gaddafi's forces put up their last major attempt to defeat the rebels on around August 2nd, when they momentarily recapture the town of Zlitan, which is near Misrata. But after that, they collapse very, very quickly. Not only do the rebels attack from the east, but they start to attack from the west. And then they put Tripoli in a pincer, attacking from the east and west. And there are some. This fighting for Tripoli, as you can imagine, where the regime is based, becomes the most intense fighting of the war for a few days. Eventually, Tripoli is captured. Gaddafi flees and goes to some last small, sympathetic areas. Eventually, the rebels find him, kill him on October 20th, and then 3 days later, the last of the regime remnants are defeated. Okay, so that's the course of the war. And now we go back to our original question. Was this a humanitarian success? How would you know? How would you measure it? And I would argue that one way of measuring it, the only way really I can think of, is to say, we know what happened with intervention. Let's document that. And then let's think about what would have happened without intervention. So compare the factual outcome to this counterfactual thought experiment of what would have happened if there had not been intervention. Some people might say, well, that's just hypothetical. Who can know? That's just guessing. And I think we can do better than guess. And I think we have to do better than guess. We have to take evidence that we have. And in this case, I think we have very, very strong evidence that suggests what the outcome would have been. Okay, so what would the outcome have been without intervention? Well, I think Gaddafi's son was right, that after Gaddafi's forces had retaken all of the cities but one, and the last city was about to fall, that essentially the war was going to last 2 more days, maybe 3, 4, or 5 more days. There was still a little bit of pocket of resistance in Misrata, on the coast, in the center of Libya, but that wasn't going to last very long. Why? Because they had no supply lines. The rebels had no way of getting weapons, ammunition, even food, water, petrol, nothing. Everything would have had to come in by sea, but Gaddafi's forces controlled the sea. So there was still a pocket of resistance in mid-March in Misrata, but it would not have lasted very long. So the whole war would have been over by maybe March 22nd or so, 2011. This would have been a 5-week war. How many people would have died in this war without intervention? I have been looking at this for nearly a year. I have had research assistants combing through every available piece of evidence, every international report, going day by day through press accounts. And my best estimate is that about 1,000 people total would have died without intervention. This gets broken down into various areas where people were killed. So in Benghazi and the east of Libya, I estimate about 500. Why do I say this? Well, the best evidence we have was provided on March 2nd by the Benghazi Medical Committee. Again, these are folks who are antagonists of Gaddafi. They are not trying to underestimate the death toll. If anything, they would have reason to exaggerate it, but I don't think they did exaggerate it. And they report that on March 2nd, 228 people were dead in Benghazi from the war. 228. From that point until March 17th, the city was under rebel control. So Gaddafi wasn't killing people in the city. So presumably no more people died until March 17th. And then if the city had fallen, some more people would have died. Tens? Scores? It's possible. But no bloodbath, because Gaddafi's forces hadn't committed a bloodbath in any other city they recaptured. So maybe another 100 would have been killed. We also have a report from March 11th that says, beyond just Benghazi, but all Benghazi and all of eastern Libya, those small towns that I had showed you, that on March 11th about 400 were dead. So if we assume another 100 would have died in the fall of Benghazi, had there not been intervention, then there would be about 500 dead in Benghazi. What about Misrata? As I said, this was the scene of the most intense fighting. Human Rights Watch reported in the second week of April that 257 were dead. Well, if 257 were dead in the second week of April, then fewer would have been dead around March 22nd. And we just have to make some interpolation. And it's somewhere, we can estimate maybe 200. And again, I'm not trying to minimize these deaths. I think one death is a tragedy. Even one injured is a tragedy. But I'm merely trying to account for the two scenarios. What would have happened without intervention, what did happen with intervention. Tripoli had one big day of fighting. One big day of fighting when there was a big uprising. The protesters decided to burn government buildings, and at that point, the regime switched from nonviolence to violence in Tripoli, and they brutally suppressed the uprising on February 21st. And on that day, according to the UN, which interviewed doctors who were in Tripoli, 200 people approximately were killed. So, but after that point, the city was quiescent, it was under Gaddafi control, and had there not been intervention, there would have been no more killing in the city. Zawiya, which is the town in the west that I showed you, which was also one of the few sites of intense fighting. Time magazine reported on March 10th that 170 had been killed. And then we have central Libya, where, as I said, there were these exchanges between the rebels and the government, and these towns switched hands 3, 4, or more times over the course of nearly 4 months. I don't know how many people were killed there. I would have thought it would have been higher, but when you look at the press accounts, you see 3 people killed here, 4 people killed here. And it's possible the government was intentionally underreporting their casualties, and the rebels were doing the same. The rebels certainly had an incentive to exaggerate their casualties, and they were not reporting high casualties. So if you add this up, it's in the range of 1,000, and some of these may actually be exaggerations. So that's my best educated guess after a year of research looking at all the available evidence of how many people would have died in Libya without intervention. That's the counterfactual. Now let's compare that to what actually happened. Well, we didn't get a 5-week war. We got a 36-week war. 8 months of war before Gaddafi finally fell and the regime remnants surrendered. There weren't 1,000 deaths. There were an estimated 8,000 to 30,000 deaths. Where do these numbers come from? 8,000 is a U.S. government estimate that was made by a U.S. government official at a Brookings Institution forum in late 2011. This official would not allow his or her name to be used, but that is the U.S. government's best estimate of how many people died in Libya. The victorious Libyan rebels estimated in September 2011, even before Gaddafi was killed, but after the rebels captured Tripoli, they estimated that at that point 30,000 Libyans had been killed. This may well be an exaggeration, but I think this marks the possible spectrum. 8,000 to 30,000 is somewhere in there is how many Libyans died. And just to go into a little bit of detail on the Libyan rebel estimate, they argue that half of these folks were Gaddafi forces, and that the other half were either rebels or civilians. And this is, plausible. And some folks may say, well, who cares? This is not civilians. This is combatants. That's different. And I would argue, well, if the goal is to save lives, then all lives matter. The fact that one has a nice uniform, the other one has a shabby uniform, and then the third one has no uniform, they're still human beings. And the goal should be to keep human beings alive, not to increase the number of them who die. We see that in Misrata, where in April, Human Rights Watch said that about 250 people were killed, by the end of the war, the rebels say 2,000 people were killed. So in that one city, the death toll also increased 8-fold, as it seems to have done at least nationwide. Okay. The last individual question that I ask before we start summing up and looking at the aftermath and trying to learn some lessons is this question that I've looked at for many years in my research. It's what I call the moral hazard of humanitarian intervention. And I wrote an article, published an article in International Studies Quarterly about this. I've also, that ISQ article was in 2008. It was entitled The Moral Hazard of Humanitarian Intervention. I also edited a book in 2006 called Gambling on Humanitarian Intervention that looks at this also. And the question is, does humanitarian intervention sometimes backfire by actually encouraging rebellion? So the goal of humanitarian intervention is to save lives, calm things down, end violent conflict. But if the international community says, when civilians start dying, we will intervene, and we will intervene in ways that actually help rebels, then the rebels now have an incentive to start a fire, to start a war where civilians are getting killed, so that they can get intervention that helps them achieve their war goals and their political goals. And so I've looked at many cases in Bosnia and Kosovo and Darfur, and I wanted to ask this question also in Libya. Two questions. One, was the whole start of the rebellion the result of the anticipation of intervention? And if yes or no, what about the escalation of rebellion once it started? And what I've found so far is there is no evidence yet that the rebellion was triggered by the hope of intervention. Doesn't mean that it wasn't, but we just have no evidence because there's almost no evidence of how this thing started. It's really, really, if there's any PhD students here, they want a good dissertation topic, they want to go do field research, it would be a wonderful, wonderful question to ask, because we just don't know what these folks were thinking, how they thought with a couple of rifles they were going to take on an army. We don't know. A couple of petrol bombs and a couple of rifles they were going to defeat, we just don't know. But it's possible they thought they would do it on their own. But what we do know is that very, very quickly, within 2 weeks of the start of the rebellion, the leaders of the rebels, both the political leader and the military leader, demanded international intervention. And they said, without that intervention, we have no hope of winning. So we don't know if that was part of their strategy from before the rebellion, but we do know within 2 weeks it became crucial to their strategy. Without intervention, they said, this rebellion will end. And I have some of the key dates up there. So Jalil, who was the head of the Transitional National Council, February 28th. That's 11 days after the start of the uprising. He already calls for a no-fly zone. And then 2 days later, the military head of the rebels, Yunus, who was later killed by fellow rebels, he asked the UK for a no-fly zone. Now, whenever I give an analysis of this moral hazard question, people say, well, the rebels shouldn't have been encouraged by any hopes of intervention. And they would say, in this case, look at the UN Security Council resolution. It said explicitly there would be no ground troops. And it said explicitly it was only to protect civilians. So the rebels could not possibly have been emboldened by this. But the reality is that rebels don't just read words, they also look at actions. And the actions of the international community were very, very different than these words. So, as I said, NATO was helping to arm, train, provide intelligence to, coordinate action with, and bomb the enemies of the rebels. Moreover, Qatar actually deployed ground troops in direct violation of the UN resolution. As they said, in October 2011, the chief of staff of the Qatar military said the number of Qataris on ground were hundreds in every region. So I'm a rebel, you're bombing my enemy, you're giving me weapons, you're giving me training, you're giving me intelligence, and you're sending me hundreds of better troops to fight with me. And you're saying, oh, but this is just to protect civilians, and we're not going to put ground troops. Actions speak louder than UN Security Council resolutions. What about post-war Libya? Is this now a democratic haven? Well, let's see. The rebels, when they came to power, one of their first acts was to do reprisal killings against Gaddafi's forces and people suspected of either supporting Gaddafi's forces or being mercenaries for Gaddafi's forces. Well, how would you know who was a mercenary? Well, they knew that some black African troops had fought with Gaddafi either because they were allies of his or potentially because he was paying them. So if you happened to have black skin, you were in trouble under the newly rebel-controlled Libya. Especially singled out was the town of Tawerga because it's next door to Misrata. And as I said, Misrata had the most intense fighting. Some folks, black Africans from Tawerga, fought with Gaddafi's forces. So when the rebels recaptured Misrata and then took Tawerga, they said, we don't like any of these people. They're all implicated in fighting with and for Gaddafi. And so they either leave or we'll kill them. And they're still displaced to this day. Do we have a centrally controlled and administered Libya with good governance? No. This country is now controlled by dozens and dozens of individual militias. Different militias control different towns, and in big cities, different militias control different neighborhoods. And if there's disputes between these militias about who controls what territory, they're settled with a gun. And we have lots and lots of killings that attest to that. The oil-rich eastern part of Libya, which is where this regional rebellion started, now says, now that we've won, we'd like to leave the country and take our oil. We want to have a referendum on secession. This intervention was supposed to stop alleged crimes. Has it stopped alleged crimes? Not according to Human Rights Watch, which as recently as April says that in Misrata, the former rebels who now control the city are continuing, quote, crimes against humanity. Human Rights Watch does not use this language lightly. Right? This is a very strong indictment. And then there was a poll that was conducted by jointly by Oxford University has an institute, and they did it with Oxford Research International as well, conducted in the end of last year, beginning of this year, and they polled Libyans and they said, what do you need? 42% of Libyans said we need a new strongman like Gaddafi. So not only is this not a liberal, democratic, peaceful, law-abiding, well-governed bastion, it is so poorly governed and so anarchical, with so much fear of life being nasty, brutish, and short, that they are yearning for a new Gaddafi. And the consequences don't stay only in Libya. There have been spillover consequences. And I'll try and wrap up quickly here because I'm just over 40 minutes now. So, you folks, I'm sure, have read about Mali. Mali, all of a sudden, has had an unexplainable explosion of civil war. How did this possibly happen? It happened explicitly direct consequence of the NATO intervention in Libya. And the reason is that there were Tuaregs who were allied with Gaddafi, and when NATO intervened, Gaddafi increased the weapons to these Tuaregs, and when he fell, they took these weapons and they went from Libya, and they went next door into Mali. And they said, now that we have all these extra weapons we didn't have, now we can do what we always wanted to do but could never do, which is take over in Mali. And within a matter of weeks, they took over the northern half of Mali, declared independence, and because they had beaten the military so badly, the military then did a coup and overthrew the president. And we now have hundreds of thousands of displaced in Mali. Oh, and by the way, these Tuareg rebels, because they were strong but not strong enough, they decided to ally with an Al-Qaeda affiliated organization. And so now we not only have a divided Mali, destruction of democracy, hundreds of thousands of displaced, but we have a new safe haven for an Al-Qaeda group in northern Mali. There's also now actually consequences in Burkina Faso because, but I won't go to this third level consequences. What about Syria? This is very important. There is a correlation between NATO deciding to intervene in Libya on behalf of violent rebels. Correlation between that and then in Syria, a peaceful, truly peaceful protest movement switching and deciding to embrace violence and to become rebels themselves. And the question is, when NATO decided to help rebels in Libya, did that encourage people in Syria to say, we need to take up arms too? I don't know. I don't know. But it is intriguing possibility. And it wouldn't be the first time that intervention in one case encouraged rebellion in another case. And when in Syria, the rebels, the protesters decided to switch from nonviolence to violence in the middle of 2011, that is when the bloodshed really escalated. Because Assad, although he was brutal, all the things that Gaddafi was accused of in Libya, Assad actually did in Syria. But when the protesters in Syria switched from nonviolence to violence, Assad became even more brutal. We started to get thousands and thousands killed. Other spillover in Somalia. Weapons from Libya not only went west to Mali, they also went east to Somalia and helped bolster the Al-Shabaab, which had been on the wane, may still be on the wane, but Al-Shabaab is another now explicitly Al-Qaeda affiliated rebel group that's benefited from this intervention. And we still don't know where the surface-to-air missiles are. So I've flown 3 or 4 times this week, and they haven't found me yet. But that's not my hope. But there are literally hundreds, possibly thousands of these surface-to-air weapons that are missing. And if you have any training whatsoever, it is very easy to knock out a civilian airliner, especially in a developing country where you don't have large standoff areas around a civilian airport. You just stand at the end of the runway, which is unguarded. You go like this. It is like shooting fish in a barrel. Okay, so let's total it up, folks. What is the net humanitarian impact of NATO's intervention? Well, it perpetuated the war, made it 7 times longer than it would have been otherwise. It magnified the death toll, making it at least 8 times bigger than it would have been otherwise. The human rights situation in Libya is unimproved at best. This is why people are yearning for a Gaddafi again. The economy is damaged, oil production is down, governance is damaged. You might not have liked Gaddafi, but I was actually in Libya once with Gaddafi. It was a very peaceful place. You should not protest against the government. You shouldn't speak badly about the government, but it was a fairly peaceful place. And there was provision of water and some sanitation, and that has all broken down. We have a contagious civil war in Mali, hundreds of thousands displaced there. We have in Syria, possibly, the reason that the rebellion escalated, and therefore the bloodshed escalated. And then the question is, and this is not a rhetorical question, this is a serious question, are there some future benefits? Will Libya 5 years down the road be such an idyllic place, so much better than it would have been 5 years down the road under Gaddafi or one of his sons, that it is worth breaking all these eggs to make this beautiful, delicious omelet down the road? It's possible. It's possible. But as of today, we have no evidence of that. As of now, the answer is no. The damage that was done greatly, greatly outweighs the benefits. So what are the lessons? I have two sets of lessons. And that's the end of my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions. First set of lessons. First is beware misinformation and disinformation. This may seem obvious, but what was really a regional rebellion was reported as a democratic uprising. And we should not confuse these, because the responses must be different. Similarly, an urban counterinsurgency is not the same as the indiscriminate targeting of civilians. In both, you'll look on your TV, you'll see a city, and you'll see a puff of smoke. But in one case, the government is really narrowly targeting rebels, and in the other case, the government is indiscriminately targeting civilians. You can't tell from that grainy image of a puff of smoke in a city. And so you need to interrogate, you need to investigate, you need to not be fooled. Why do I say misinformation and disinformation? Because the rebels were clearly putting out disinformation. They were saying there's going to be a bloodbath. They were saying he is targeting civilians indiscriminately. That's disinformation. But there was also innocent misinformation. So one of the reasons that the Western world thought so many people were being killed in those first few days is there was a very nice French medical doctor who happened to be working in Benghazi, and he had never been in such a situation before, and he started seeing this, and he saw 5 or 10 people coming into his hospital, and he said, if these are the ones coming into my hospital, imagine how much there must be in Benghazi and all of eastern Libya. And he went on TV and he said, I think there are 1,000 dead already in Benghazi, at least another 1,000 dead in eastern Libya, and it's growing. I really think he believed it. I think he was a very nice man, but he just was out of his expertise. Another lesson is this one I talked about, moral hazard. And this is my #1 recommendation that I've come up with after working on this for about 10 years in many cases. And that is, the West should only intervene on humanitarian grounds in cases where the government is responding grossly disproportionately with violence against some protest. So if the protesters are nonviolent, really nonviolent, and the government is responding and killing these innocent civilians, then intervention is justified because it will do more good than harm. Or if you have a tiny little rebellion, it's an armed rebellion, and the government says, well, we're going to kill all the civilians. We're going to drain the sea in order to capture the fish. We're going to commit genocide in response to a little rebellion. That's also grossly disproportionate, and the international community should intervene. But if we have proportionate retaliation, that is, we have an armed rebellion trying to overthrow the government, and the government responds by trying to kill the rebels, then we should not intervene, because we will do two bad things. One, we will prolong and escalate the violence and the death, and the killing and the dying in this one case, but moreover, we'll encourage rebellions in other countries, as we may well have done in Syria. And lastly, and this is one that really, even though I've been working on humanitarian intervention for a long time, this really came to me from the Libya case. And that is that humanitarian intervention often devolves into regime change. Why? Because in order for the Western world to get public support for an intervention, it has to demonize the regime against which it is intervening. So it can't just say, well, this is a sort of bad guy, so we're going to start bombing his country. They have to say, this is a really bad guy who kills innocent civilians. But once you've demonized the leader with such rhetoric, how can you make a deal with that leader? You can't make a deal with the devil. So at that point, you have to overthrow the devil. Okay? But once you switch from protecting civilians to regime change, now you prolong and escalate and exacerbate the war. And you increase the human cost, which undermines the original rationale. And it also raises this last question, which I'll leave you with, which is, lots of people I know support humanitarian intervention in principle, the idea. Lots of people I know also say the West shouldn't go around just overthrowing willy-nilly the leaders of developing countries, that that's a neo-imperialism and it's unacceptable to them. So what do if the one almost inevitably leads to the other? To put it succinctly, can you support humanitarian intervention if you also oppose the forcible overthrow of regimes that are not deliberately targeting civilians? That's a moral dilemma and a policy dilemma. And I'll leave you with that, and thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kuperman, for your topical lecture, also for your challenging conclusion. I've also noticed that when you do this, something happens with your computer, but it only happens when you do it, and not when I do it.
What happens?
You get a beautiful sound that reinforces your arguments. Thank you very much. Of course, we're looking forward to a discussion now. It might be that you feel invited to discuss right away the spillover effects to Syria, and that is of course a topical issue, but perhaps we will keep that for the second round. And I would like you to comment first of all on the contradiction, or the contradiction between humanitarian intervention and regime change following that, and on what would have happened if no intervention would have taken place. I think that would be an appropriate part to start with, and then In the second round, we'll come to the spillovers and the topical issues nowadays. Yes? Would you take questions one on one, or would you like to have a group of questions together?
You are the rector.
Yeah.
I learned long ago to defer to authority.
Answer them right away and then see what happens.
I think we can take, it depends if there's a lot of questions, we should group them, and if there's just a few, then we can take them.
I think there'll be a lot of, so 1, 2, 3, Ellen, you start.
I appreciate the counterfactual scenario being explored so rigorously and getting lots of different data and so on, seeing what could have happened if. And I think it's fairly convincing, that part of the paper. The part I want to ask about, though, is some of the bits that are missing, which is, you ask, well, what would be the long-term benefits? I mean, I think there's still a presumption behind your paper that the West means well. You know, that somehow they mean well, but they go wrong sometimes, and they get misinformed or disinformed. But really, these are the good guys who, the things don't work out quite how they intend. And I really question that after all the evidence we have, that the West is not in the least bit the good guys, and that there are very clearly agendas, economic agendas and other interesting agendas, which mean that they're quite happy for Iraq and Libya and everywhere else to be in total chaos and utter disarray, and for civilian casualties to be the price that's paid for economic interests. And I really don't think you consider that seriously at all. That was my first point. And my second point is that if only 42% want Gaddafi, what's the other 58% want?
Okay, thank you. I'll guess from the advisory council.
Yes, you're pointing very clearly to the role of NATO in Libya. But I would in fact also to go back to where the mandate comes from the UN Security Council. And also you stressed humanitarian intervention, the follow-up of that, if you may say it bluntly, is responsibility to protect. Is your discourse also saying that the responsibility to protect, the way it has been shapen in the UN, is not feasible? Is it an illusion to strive for, or is that another future, another way of conceiving responsibility?
Is what another way? The way
do you see other ways of striving for
wonderful
responsibility to protect?
Thank you very much for your lecture. It's very interesting. You started with the information part and you ended up also with the information part. So I wanted to ask you a bit more precisely. There was a discrepancy between the media reporting, if I understood, and the real facts and figures that you came up with through thorough research. Could you also tell us a little bit about your idea how these media reports with their figures, were they fed by systems that first maybe asked, perhaps there were already written texts by, well, you never know, in Congo there certainly is. But could you say, have you found evidence on how these media came up with this kind of wrong information?
Okay, can I think that's a good first three, otherwise I'll start to forget.
Okay, right.
So I'll ask the next group to be patient. So here I am saying that all of you, or most of you, or certainly my government and the Western press is naive about what really happened in Libya. And here is Professor Hinchen saying, no, Kuperman, you are the one who is naive. You are not cynical and skeptical enough. This critique which you're offering is as you know, is not a new one about humanitarian intervention. It's perennial from what at least I understand is the democratic left in Europe, and started coming out in the early 1990s when there were interventions in the former Yugoslavia. The argument was made, these are not really humanitarian interventions, these are to snuff out the last bastion of communism in Europe. And once that was done, now the democratic left couldn't make that argument anymore. They couldn't say that the West is intervening to wipe out communism, so they said, the West is intervening to promote the interests of multinational corporations and capitalism. And, you know, in some cases, that may be true, but we see interventions, for example, in places like Somalia in 1992, December, when George Bush, the first George Bush president, decided to intervene. I saw no commercial interest. I saw no security interest. The Cold War was over. And so I try to, you know, it's not the main focus of my work, but it is something that I look at, which is why do we intervene in some places, where and how, and why don't we intervene in other places. And perhaps I'm naive, but I really believe that the interventions in places like Bosnia, in places like Kosovo, and the extent that there was intervention in Darfur, and there was considerable intervention, tens of thousands of UN troops, the intervention in some other places, and the intervention here in Libya was truly driven by media reporting that showed what looked to be like existing massacres of civilians and impending even larger massacres of civilians. And certainly, for example, I think President Obama was driven by that. And if you look, he was advised by Susan Rice and Samantha Power, both of whom have made their life's work to say that the U.S. should intervene on humanitarian grounds, even where it has no strategic interest. Are there other things that come into play? Sure. President Obama doesn't want to be shown up by President Sarkozy. He doesn't want to be accused of saying, well, the rest of the world wants to help and you don't want to help. But again, that's driven by humanitarianism. What about Sarkozy? He was certainly driven partly by the fact that he was embarrassed about supporting the Tunisian regime, which was then overthrown in the Arab Spring. And he wanted to say, well, no, I'm really for the people, so I wasn't in Tunisia, but I can make up for it by being so in Libya. But that's not intervening on behalf of capitalism, for oil, for multinational corporations, to snuff out communism. So I think it's still ultimately driven by humanitarianism, but I can't prove it definitively, and so perhaps I'm just naive. On the Oxford poll, I said 42% said they needed a new strongman like Gaddafi, and you rightly say, well, what about the other 58%? I could say to you, just go look at the website where the poll was published, but unfortunately they haven't put it on the web. And I think the reason is they were stunned and embarrassed by the results, because this is not what they were expecting. They were expecting that the results were going to be, no one would of course want another Gaddafi, and that they all had supported various types of democracy. And so they held a very quiet news conference in Oxford in February, I think, of this year, and did not post the results. And so I had to go to Oxford University and dig up the results. That's first of all. Second of all, these folks were being interviewed in a we'll call them the victorious rebels, in a Libya that the victorious rebels now control. And they're being interviewed and say, do you support these victorious rebels who now control your life or death, or would you oppose them? You want them overthrown? And so you have to be pretty stupid, I think, or brave, to say, I don't support these folks who control my life and death. And so it's, to me, remarkable that if 42% said it in a poll, then the real number is much, much larger than that. And it's not surprising. I mean, this you know, Hobbes, one of my favorite authors, I think he got it right in 1649, or whenever he wrote. When things are this bad, when there's so much anarchy, people say, screw my rights, screw representation, I want security. I want a strong person who's going to guarantee my security. And that's what the Libyans are saying, because there's so much chaos. Okay. So is my conclusion that R2P is such a failure it should be discarded, or is my conclusion that R2P needs somehow to be reformed, changed the way it's implemented? That's my paraphrase, I think, of your question. And my answer is the latter. I am not against the R2P. I'm against the R2P as it has been implemented, because I think it has caused more harm than good, and it has caused the types of outcomes that it was intended to prevent. And so what I've argued for now for several years is changing how we implement the R2P. And I have come up with 5 recommendations for how to do so. They're contained most succinctly. I actually wrote a piece about Libya in March of 2011, and so you can get it in one page. They're expanded upon in an article I did in 2009 in the Whitehead Journal of International Affairs, and it's called Rethinking the R2P. And of these 5 recommendations, the most important one I have is the one I highlighted today, which is the international community should only intervene on humanitarian grounds in cases where the government is using disproportionate force against an uprising. That is grossly disproportionate. Grossly disproportionate. And if we had that sort of a policy of implementing the R2P, then it would send a signal to both sides to moderate their use of violence. It would say to the rebels, if you think you are going to get us to help you by starting a civil war, not likely. So don't do it. That should discourage rebels from, or disgruntled groups from using violence. At the same time, we say to the government, if you think that any little uprising can be used as an excuse to commit genocide or massive ethnic cleansing or something, and that we'll just stand aside because you're only responding to a rebellion, then the answer is no. Don't be naive. If you really are so grossly disproportionate in your use of violence, we will intervene. And so we would say to the government too, to moderate its use of violence. And if both sides are moderating their use of violence, we should see less civil war and less harm to non-combatants. But as I say, that's only one of the 5 recommendations. Another one, for example, is that at the same time we're discouraging violent resolution of these conflicts, we should be encouraging peaceful resolution of these conflicts. We should be supporting non-violent groups, and in all of these, so for example in Syria, there's a non-violent opposition and a violent opposition. And one possibility for the international community would be to say we're going to really help every way we can the non-violent opposition, but not the violent opposition, because a civil war, an escalated civil war in Syria, regardless of how it ends, it's going to be horrible for the civilians of Syria in the meantime. And there are all sorts of other things. So I won't go through, but the short answer is reform the R2P, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then the last question is media reporting. This is again another question I've looked at for a long time. I wrote an article which was based on my first book, The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention. I wrote this article for this International Press Institute about reporting of crimes in civil war. And what I argued in that is that in Rwanda, which was the focus of my first book, there was a gross underreporting of the killing in the first 2 weeks. They underreported the numbers terribly, and they underreported the nature of the killing. So they said this is basically a civil war, each side is causing some casualties on the other side, and there's 10,000 or so people who've been killed in the first 2 weeks. And in fact, there was a targeted attempt at genocide on one side, and there were really massive killings also in the other side, and the death toll in those first 2 weeks was probably on the order of 300,000. Okay, so they totally blew it. The Western reporters totally blew it. And I go through in this article why they blew it. They were almost all located in the capital, and the capital has only 4% of the population. And the violence in the capital was different than the violence elsewhere in the country because the regime wanted it to be different. They didn't want these press reporters to see this sort of massive killing. So, in any case, what I said in this article then is that ever since Rwanda, the international press has made the exact opposite mistake. They never want to miss the next Rwandan genocide, and so they've reported it in 10 other cases where it wasn't happening. Right? You don't get nearly as much flack for exaggerating the violence that's occurring as for underreporting. Nobody, no Western reporter has been criticized because, you reported that Gaddafi killed 1,000 people here, but he only killed 100. No Western reporter has been criticized for that. Lots of Western reporters have been criticized for missing the Rwandan genocide. So there is a market incentive now, unfortunately, to over-report. And you combine that with misinformation and disinformation. So I told you about this one doctor in Benghazi, the French doctor. That's the misinformation. The disinformation was an organized effort by the rebels, their political authorities, and their allies around the world. So this word bloodbath, it intrigued me. I said, where did this word come from? This word, that there was about to be a bloodbath in Benghazi. And I looked at, and if you look from the beginning, February 17th, through beginning of March, 7th, 8th, 9th, this word does not appear. You do a Nexus Lexus search, this word does not appear. Gaddafi is recapturing towns, the word never appears. All of a sudden the word appears, right? And it came from a Libyan expat who was part of the Transition National Council in Western Europe. In Western Europe. This is the man who's the expert on what's going on in Benghazi. He's sitting, I think it was in Geneva. He's the one who says, we're about to have a bloodbath, not here, but over there where I'm not.
Yeah, but that is information that is on the media.
Well, let me just finish. Just last thing is, if you then look the next day, it goes from one hit, one article, to hundreds of articles that now use the word bloodbath. And then President Obama, the next week, when he explains why we intervened, he says, you know, we must intervene in cases to prevent genocide. So I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, but then he should have had also other information.
The reporter.
I just know the NATO and the USA.
That's a very that's a fair question, and I think Helen's probably nodding. Back there, and would say, yeah, they didn't want to know. This is possible, but again, just as the press doesn't want to miss the next genocide, nobody wants to miss the next genocide. As I mentioned, Susan Rice. Susan Rice was working for the Clinton administration during the Rwandan genocide, and she was opposed to intervention. Opposed. Now, imagine your conscience. You don't want to make that mistake again. So you are going to be very, very open to information that says this is an incipient genocide, and you're going to be very close to information that says no, this is just propaganda, because you don't want to make that mistake again. So I think there's a structural sort of thing, and especially since the West doesn't pay a price. When the West screws up, does the West pay a price? No. The people in this poor developing country pay a price, right? So the market mechanism is all screwed up.
Okay.
Right?
Any of the discussants who want to return to the reply? Helen, short?
Yes, well, we picked the opposite cases to illustrate just like everyone does, we picked the evidence that would suit our case. So you avoided Iraq and Afghanistan, and I picked Iraq. Because I thought Iraq was more of a precedent for Libya than any of the other interventions. And it's the logic of certain type of security-driven so-called humanitarian intervention, which I still think has got a very sound economic.
That's fine. I mean, the only thing I would say is that Iraq was clearly not a humanitarian intervention. It was a security-based intervention. It was in the wake of 9/11, and explicitly, the George W. Bush administration said, we're doing this because Saddam Hussein, number one, wants to acquire nuclear weapons, and number two, is in bed with terrorists like Al-Qaeda, in bed with Al-Qaeda, right? So it was only after the war went lousy that they then started coming, and they didn't find weapons of mass destruction, then they started saying, but we also did it for humanitarian reasons. I don't think anyone, if you look back, they did not say they were doing it for humanitarian reasons until after they were already there, which is very different than Libya.
Okay, we keep it there. New round of questions. We'll start with first, then Peter van Dijk. Then, what is your name?
Dimitri Zaski.
Okay, and then the fourth one here. Please.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I won't.
Two.
Small. Two small ones, alright. One is, I'm surprised, or I'm curious as to why you don't see a pattern in these interventions, which even before Iraq, the first Iraq war, there was that campaign of misinformation, the ambassador's daughter was someone testifying about babies being ripped out of incubators, And the fact that Saddam Hussein, according to some theories, was actually encouraged to go into Kuwait as a deliberate ploy to justify intervention and regime change, rather than something more naive about just not having enough intelligence, which a lot of us find hard to believe. So if I can comment on that. And then the second one, it's on the screen right now, is saying that interveners often refuse to cut a deal with the regime that demonized, but in the case of Libya, they were cutting deals left, right, and center. Sarkozy had invited Gaddafi maybe a year ago, to pitch up his tent in the lawns in Paris. The Brits had released one of the Lockerbie bombers, which apparently now it turns out he might have been innocent.
Okay, I get you.
And et cetera, et cetera. So what happened there? They were making deals, so...
Clear question.
Yeah, I would like to disagree with you. I think
You're not the only one, it seems.
I think you don't pay enough attention to the historical dimension. I mean, this was the longest lasting African dictator, and this was the chance to get rid of him. I mean, they tried in the 90s, it didn't work out, and now they use civilian argument. Okay, but that's to sell the whole operation. But we know, and I worked in Libya for a short time, and I think it was a very repressive regime. It was no fun at all working there, talk to people. People were very demotivated, but more seriously, it was of course destabilizing a number of African countries. I happened to stay in a hotel where he received all these foreign presidents, and then would hand over all the money to buy them behind his ideas. He was a man behind Lockerbie, and well, as he said, they finally agreed, the French and even the Americans, and they thought they locked him in, but he came back again with all these unexpected things. So this was the chance to get rid of him. Now, I think your counterfactual analysis also weak. I mean, in Syria, where there's no intervention, we're already above 30,000. So how long does that have to go on? But that's the topic for the second half of this discussion.
Well, you've already started it.
But I certainly, this the message here, of course, is one, it's a warning to other dictators. Two, unfortunately, it is the paralysis of the African Union. There are just too many of his friends who are still supporting him because they have been paid by him for a long time and they want to continue this financial support. But the new thing was that also there was support from a number of North African countries. So the whole Arab Spring worked against him, and that made it easier for the US and its allies to revenge. So I think with a bit of historical analysis and not taking at face value this argument of civilian population, but rather, how do we get rid of this guy? The whole thing fits together very nicely.
Okay. First of all, let me thank you for this most interesting talk. I've had the pleasure of listening to many of my professors, but I haven't listened as I did in the last 60 seconds for a while. Furthermore, if I couldn't help but notice, seeing as I'm an international law student, that you use humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect in the very same sentence, also phrasing Iraq as a humanitarian intervention. Some sort of
No, I didn't. That was behind you.
However, do you see them as the very same, or do you see them as two distinctive things in international law? And if so, would you, your proposals, your proposals improving the responsibility to protect, how would you link them to the three-pillar approach as stipulated? Three-pillar approach, three-pillar approach on the responsibility to protect, as proposed by Ban Ki-moon in 2009.
Okay, that was the end of the question.
Yes.
Thank you. We just didn't get free.
Three pillars.
Yeah. Three pillars.
And the final, or the fourth?
Professor,
Yes, sir.
8 long years of war between Iraq and Iran. Then Sabra and Shatila incidents, Israel's bombing of West Bank and Gaza, then the recent massacre and genocide of the Sri Lankan government, where they butchered and killed more than 10,000 Tamils. White House, 10 Downing Street, are the European Union members of the NATO. Nobody could raise any question about that for international humanitarian help and support. Few people were killed in Libya, and they started destroying Libya and Libya's infrastructure.
And now the question?
And now my question is, I appreciate your research. I highly commend that. You mentioned about the casualties, between 8 and 30,000. Will there be any opportunity that those who are behind this bombing of Libya and the results of these casualties and ongoing, atrocities by the rebels and the Libyan council, which are, committing worst human rights violations right now? So will there be any chance that international ICC would take any responsibility, would take these people who are responsible, under the international humanitarian law or criminal law, to get these people who are responsible of these miserable, atrocities and failings?
Thank you for this question. This is very good.
Okay, good questions, good questions. Yeah, so this was the disinformation intentional by the interveners? Did they make their own excuse to intervene? I'm skeptical of that for a couple of reasons. One is that the US military really didn't want to intervene. And if you go back and look, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert Gates, he said the last thing we need to be doing is intervening militarily in another Muslim country. He was having headaches for years under the George W. Bush administration and then under the Obama administration, having to manage these two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he really didn't want to do it. So is it possible that the politicians wanted to do it and force the military? I guess it's possible, but I don't think it really goes with that narrative about the U.S. really wanting to do this. As for the cozying up with Gaddafi, and does that undermine my argument that you can't, you can't cut a deal with someone? Well, there was a big change in 2003, and that is that Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction, and number one, and number two, started providing intelligence against Al-Qaeda. And those were both significant compromises and a very strong signal of changed intention. And the US took that seriously and started working with them, and I think other NATO allies did as well, including the Brits and the French. Now in the British case, did it have something to do with oil? I think absolutely it had something to do with oil. That is the decision to release the Lockerbie, alleged Lockerbie, convicted Lockerbie bomber. But I don't think either of those undermines my argument that the West was to some degree fooled about what was going on in Libya, and that once the West decided to intervene, they had to re-demonize Gaddafi, and once they re-demonized Gaddafi, they couldn't turn around again and make a deal. And they were sort of explicit about this, because people said, well, why not cut a deal? And people more important than I were saying that, and the International Crisis Group were saying that, and the Obama administration said, absolutely no deal. This guy has to leave power, step down and leave power. Okay. Did the U.S. do this again? There was a real strategic reason for doing this to get rid of a dictator that had been a thorn in the side of the U.S. again, I don't think that was the initial motivation, but I think it made it, once the decision was made, well, it made it easier to make the decision, right? Because Gaddafi was a dirty word in the U.S. It's like up there with Hitler. It's like it was very easy to think that it would be nice to get rid of this guy. But I don't think it was because he was destabilizing lots of countries. That was the reason I didn't like him. I really didn't like Gaddafi. But I didn't like Gaddafi because he had started civil wars all throughout Africa that had gotten tens or hundreds of thousands of people killed, including he was the first to arm Paul Kagame so that he could invade Rwanda and help trigger this horrible retaliatory genocide. So I really didn't like Muammar Gaddafi. He'd mellowed a little bit. I would actually say he'd started to be a little bit more of a peacemaker. In places like Darfur, half the time he was stirring things up, half the time he was settling things down. But I think he was actually trying to build a reputation as a statesman. I don't know what was going on in that head, under that hair. Okay. Does Syria disprove the counterfactual? It's a good question. Right? I would say that it's possible, right? Because Syria, we got without intervention, as you say, we have over 10,000 killed. But there's two differences, I think. One is that in Syria, the regime used brutal force against peaceful protesters, and Gaddafi didn't do that. Okay, and so that helped stir the pot in ways that didn't happen in Libya. Secondly, in Syria, when they recapture an area, they take vengeance out on that area. And that also further stirs the pot. Gaddafi didn't do that. Gaddafi, in that sense, was, well, we can say smarter or dumber. He had a different strategy. He's dead, and Assad is alive. So who's the smarter one? I don't know. But, you know, the more humanitarian strategy was Gaddafi's strategy, which is you just defeat your armed rivals, and then you are nice to the civilians in the hope that you can regain their loyalty. And the evidence we have is that once he had defeated this uprising, it would have ended. But again, I can't prove that. So you know, if this would have extended longer as Syria's did, then the counterfactual that I presented underestimates the death toll. But I think it still would have been much, much lower without intervention than with intervention. Do I think that humanitarian intervention and R2P are identical? Yes, I do. I have written a lot about this, and it's not because I'm invested for some reason in saying that. It's just because I look at these things and I keep reading these things with people telling me that they're different, but they look the same to me. And so we've had two versions of the R2P. We had the ISIS report in 2001, and then we've had the second three-pillar version, both of which really are Gareth Evans heavily influenced things. So he first said the one, and then he said the other, and he said they're different, and he said they're identical. They're different, but they do the same thing. They each have three. It always has to be three. And so he said it's like a cake. It's got 3 layers this way, but you slice it three. Anyway, I don't know. But in any case, what do they say? They say that, and I've written, I think, an article, I think it was a review of Gareth Evans' book, and I think it's titled something like R2P, Old Wine in New Bottles, question mark. I like question marks at the end of the titles, I guess. So what does it say to the new version? It says that when there's bad things happening in a country, you should first offer to help that country resolve the situation peacefully. And then when that doesn't work, then you should use non-coercive means, certainly non-military means, to try to persuade or encourage the state to do the right thing. And then when that doesn't work, then on a case-by-case basis, and only with UN authorization, Security Council resolution, you should be willing to use all necessary means, including force, to protect civilians. And I say to myself, well, that's wonderful, but that's exactly what we were doing starting in 1991 with the Kurds of northern Iraq, and then in Bosnia, starting in April 1992, And then in Somalia, in December of 1992, I can go through case by case by case by case. This is exactly what we do. The first thing we say is, you're doing bad things to your people. Stop doing that. We'll give you any support you need, any help, any guidance you need. And then when that doesn't work, then we say, well, we're going to sanction you because you're doing the wrong thing, but we're not going to violate sovereignty, so we're just going to put economic sanctions and an arms embargo and so forth. And then if bad things continue to happen, then we authorize first a no-fly zone, and then maybe a little bit of support for safe areas and so forth. And when that doesn't work, then we start bombing. And when that doesn't work, we send in the ground troops, right? This has been what we've done since the end of the Cold War. And so when someone says, well, that was humanitarian intervention, but this is R2P and it's different, I say, how is it different? It's simply a new name. It's simply a new name. I see absolutely no difference. Okay, now the last two questions were,